Mike, welcome to the inaugural, currently unnamed Midship Podcast. Very good to have you. I'd love for you to just introduce yourself and give some of your background.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Mike Levy, CEO of Cherry Hill Advisory. We're a risk advisory firm focused on emerging risks, internal audit, Sarbanes-Oxley, and all things internal audit. Previously, I was the chair of the IAA's North American Board of Directors from 2023 to 2024, and I'm currently on the IAA Standards Board. Really passionate about the internal audit profession.
So Mike, given your background with the IIA, one thing we're always very curious about is we hear about new standards coming top down from places, how those actually filter down from the PCAOB over to the IIA, and how in practice does, when a new technology comes out, that gets converted into some new standard. I'd love for you to talk through what that process looks like.
Yeah, it's interesting. When you think about things like regulatory bodies like the PCAOB and versus IIA standard setting, they're actually fairly different. There are indirect dependencies that happen, but I would tell you what we have found from a standard setting perspective. One thing that makes our profession and the IAA very unique is that we are an independent standard setter for all things internal audit. So I'll talk about them both separately. So from a global internal audit standard, so they're the new standards that the internal audit profession is following that went live this year, they're representative of what we view the global profession to be. And frankly, they are set by professionals that are volunteers in our profession on the standards board, but there's an exposure period that happens with them. And frankly, what we have today as our global internal audit standards are representative of our entire profession globally. And going back when we exposed those standards, and there were something like 19,000 pieces of feedback that came back from the profession, the exposure draft to the finals changed something like 30%. And those changes were meant to be reflective of what works for our global profession. So while there are some indirect dependencies and stakeholder groups that certainly gave feedback and that ultimately impacted and influenced the standards, they are their own independent set of standards. Now, when you think about things like Sarbanes-Oxley and the PCAOB, there's some indirect dependencies that happen there, because what happens, then the trickle-down effect that happens with PCAOB auditing standards, which are more focused on external audit, Sarbanes-Oxley compliance, internal controls. The PCAOB will regulate, and it's always an after-the-fact process because an external auditor goes through their process. They then go through an inspection by the PCAOB, which has findings. Sometimes those findings are more public, sometimes they are less public, depending on if it's a type 1 or type 2 report. And then based on the feedback the firm receives during their inspection, impacts how the firm's methodology that's doing the external audit changes what a company has to do. So you see indirect ripple effects from that, because what an external auditor asks of their companies that they are auditing, and then subsequently how internal audit needs to respond when they are charged with Sarbanes-Oxley, that changes. So I would say when you think about our global internal audit standards versus something like PCAOB auditing standards, there's not a direct correlation, but there are ripple effects between the two that can certainly happen based on some of the regulatory changes that happen.
So beyond just the standards themselves, we're obviously seeing the rate of technology change exponentially increasing. Even coming from a software engineering background, it's difficult, the people who are building this tech, to keep up with it sometimes. For a more traditional industry like audit, which is naturally more slower and methodical, what do you think is required to change to be able to keep up with that pace of underlying change in the technology?
Yeah, that's a tough question, because I agree. Audit does tend to be more methodical and slower to adopt. I would tell you when we look at our profession, we're experiencing a very unusual time. And obviously generative AI is a huge component of everything that we are seeing and doing, both in our personal and in the business world. But when we look at the level of risks that are occurring and the speed at which those risks are occurring, cybersecurity alone, when you think about that, it's like a $10 trillion problem across businesses, and it's nearly a top one risk. And when you look at the velocity at which emerging technologies, in terms of the risks that we have to audit from a business perspective, it continues to rise and rise, and generative AI is a key piece of that. But the part of the issue there is like the upskilling of our profession, because you have a lot of professionals that didn't grow up with this technology, and our businesses are learning, and we're going to be expected to audit against some of these things. But if we're not walking that walk and we're not using some of that technology, how can we ever be expected to understand it deeply enough that we can ask the right questions when we're going to try to audit it? So I think one of the messages that when I talk to other practitioners and when I talk to other chief audit executives that I always try to embark is that it's really important that we keep an open mind with how we're doing things. And the most dangerous thing we can do as professionals is say, we've always done it this way, we should keep doing it that way going forward. And that goes to people, process, and technology. And I think I have not met a single chief audit executive that has been able to express to me that we have all of the resources we need, whether it's time, money, people, to get done and cover all of the risks we want to do within our organizations. And I think when you think about the speed of risk and the speed of change, we're entering a time where we need to think differently, and we need to look at how we adopt different processes and technologies so that we can get more risk coverage, and then we can better support our companies so that our time is spent and focused on having a seat at the table and solving some of the biggest challenges that our businesses are facing today.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we hear very generically said is that as the technology enablement improves and increases, roles become more specialized. And would you be able to talk to more of the specialization of the audit role beyond just learning a new piece of technology?
Yeah, I think if you go back 10 years even, and you looked at how internal audit functions were dispersed and segregated, you would have a data analytics team, and maybe not even 10, maybe even 5 years ago, right? You'd have a data analytics team, you'd have an IT audit team, you'd have a business process team, sometimes you'd have a fraud team, and it would be very siloed and separated. And some of those things still exist today in audit functions, but one thing I think that is becoming more and more clear to practitioners and internal audit functions is that every single audit is an IT audit at the end of the day in some way, shape, or form. So when you think about where you had siloed skill sets, I remember back in my days in Big Four internal audit, we used to be told you had to be an SAP expert, or you had to be an Oracle expert, and you were focused on one really specific thing. I don't think it's prudent to always have those types of skill sets. So yes, when you're doing a cybersecurity audit, having a really technical firewall, background where you can audit ports and understand all the port settings so that you can audit that. Yeah, I think there's a time and a place for that. But when you look at how issues are happening and problems are happening, it's the business issues that are causing all of the challenges. So everybody has to have some business process experience. Everybody has to have some IT audit experience. And at the end of the day, when we think about how that translates to our professionals and sort of growing our talent and the pipeline of that, I do believe that so much of the experiences that we need to have as a practitioner actually becomes much less on the technical side and much more on the people skill side, right? So it's how do you interact? How do you develop relationships? Do you know enough to think critically and ask the right questions? We could probably do a whole podcast just on prompting generative AI tools and understanding whether they are useful or not. And we could certainly talk about that, but I think professionals really need to learn the skill that lets them know how to ask the right questions at the right time, because it's going to be impossible for them to be subject matter experts in every single emerging risk and that is crossing their doorsteps in today's world.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's funny you were saying about the Big Four being sold as SAP experts, because I remember first day on the job at Deloitte when I first started, I was sold as the expert on whatever project was about to come up as well. So.
Yep. After you've done it one time, you become an expert.
Exactly. Yeah. It was good. It was a good feeling actually. It was very motivational.
Absolutely.
First day on the roll. So as both those roles become more specialized, the technology enablement increases. One of the things we've been trying to think through a lot at Midship is how does the relationship between the second and third line change? Do they get closer together, move further apart? Is there more of a need for independence between the two, or just any thoughts as to how that's going to evolve?
Yeah. One thing philosophically, and it may not be a popular opinion, but obviously within our profession, there are concepts of independence and objectivity. I think as we continue to evolve this profession and we think about moving, used to be nearly 100% assurance-based auditing. Now you're sitting there with assurance and advisory services, i.e. consulting type services. I think the term objectivity becomes the most important term that we have to think about as practitioners. Yes, there's always a need and a place for independence as it relates to assurance-based projects, and we have to maintain our independence, especially from the first line. But over the years, you're starting to see, and I think you will continue to see in the upcoming years, more and more of a convergence of the second and the third line. And there's always exceptions to that, right? So I think within highly regulated industries, you will see much more defined silos that exist between second and third line. But as a real life example, you're seeing a lot of internal audit functions globally take on roles within enterprise risk management. You're seeing them take on roles with fraud risk management. Sarbanes-Oxley testing is another great example, because you do sometimes see that sitting within a controllership group or a more traditional second line function. But there are, especially across North America, there is a huge preponderance of internal audit functions that are responsible for that testing. And if you take a step back and you look at the IAA's Vision 2035 and where we see our profession going in 2035, so much of that report talks about the need for internal audit to continue to become more consultative in nature. And I think you'll see as that evolution continues and we continue on that path, you're going to see more and more of a convergence of the second and the third line.
And the convergence is the functional nature of what the role entails as opposed to the mission statement. I think that sounds like from
Yeah, you're going to believe, and this is my personal opinion, I believe you're going to start seeing internal audit try to shift more of their time from assurance, and they're going to want to do the assurance-based projects and work in a more efficient and effective manner, and hopefully in a more automated manner. And I think you're going to want to see them shift their time to things that the business perceives higher value tasks and strategic. So use the topic of AI governance as a real life example. You look at companies today, and every company is in some way, shape, or form trying to adopt AI. And if we wait to provide assurance over what the AI adoption process looks like, wait till they're completely done, we're going to have missed a huge opportunity within our profession to sit there and actually have a seat at the table and help them think through the development of it and think through the proper risks and what controls need to be put in place and who needs to be involved and what do you do when something happens? What does your crisis communication look like? And again, I always am hesitant when I hear an internal audit function say we are an assurance only provider, because there's so many things happening that if we wait, we're going to be missing so much opportunity to generate value within the business.
Yeah, I think there's a massive opportunity for better interfacing with the engineering org in particular, just because having been through that process of getting ready for a first year SOX audit, ready for the IPO process, there were some questions which I was getting from an IA team sort of the day before something was due, which I was like, hey, I really wish this had come up in a design review for us. Would have made this a lot easier to bake it in earlier in the process. So that's something which I see very obvious next step for that function. I think one of the things people think about a lot as well is as some of the SOX work is taken off of the hands of the internal audit team, obviously you've spoken to like broadly what where that reallocation is going to happen. Do you see most of that work as more one-time projects which are sitting on a backlog today, don't get the attention they deserve? Or is that kind of repeated cyclical work? Or what is the balance between the two of those?
I think it's a few different things that are going to happen all at once, is my opinion. Because I think in some way, shape, or form, I don't think this is 10 years out. I think this is within the next couple of years, you're going to start seeing very significant adoption of new processes and technology. First and foremost, I think when you look at something like Sarbanes-Oxley testing, and frankly, even more broadly than that, when you look at control testing, so much control testing that occurs today is on a sample basis. And sample-based testing is a really important aspect to it, but the more things we can test in larger population sets and look at more samples and more data at one time, that gives us a lot more coverage and a lot more risk coverage and a lot more comfort within an organization. But we have a sample design and a sampling methodology because, frankly, a big piece of that is there's only so many hours in the day, and we have to appropriate our risk coverage in a way that manages risk to a level that we can so that we hit enough areas with the finite amount of resources we have. So one thing I get really excited about when I look at new technologies and I watch how some of this is evolving is I think we're going to be able to do a lot more with a lot less time involved. So remember, going back 5-10 years, I saw a presentation that talked about where management perceives value of the internal audit function. And imagine like a heat map, like a very traditional heat map. And there are certain tasks that we as internal audit function, it's an expectation of our roles. It's something we have to do. We have to do it well. We have to do it right. But management sort of just takes it for granted. And I hate to say it, but something like Sarbanes-Oxley testing, I think when people describe internal audit's function, and if you were to ask a member of the audit committee or you're a member of your executive management team, what's the best thing internal audit did for you this year? Very few of them are going to articulate the SOX program as that thing. They're going to probably articulate the SOX program, well, that's something we have to get done. They make that as easy and efficient as possible for us, but it's sort of a necessary evil that we have to go through. And I think if you think about it in terms of that, obviously we want to do it well, we want to do it accurately, we want to get as much coverage as we can. But at the same time, like if I could be spending my time, as a CAE, if I'm sitting there saying, how do I triage my time and resources, I'd much rather have my team focus on the emerging risk topics or the management requests that are coming in or some of these topics like AI governance or cyber risk or data privacy or the plethora of other regulatory concerns that businesses have to deal with on a daily basis. To me, that's going to be more higher value tasks that are mission critical to the board. I mean, if I have my audit function spending something, and some functions I know do this, spend 50 to 70% of their time on Sarbanes-Oxley testing. Well, I go back to cyber. One cyber event happening in an organization could end an organization. It could be a business ending event depending on the severity. Yet I'm spending 70% of my time on compliance procedures versus helping my company think through some of those really significant risks that are going to be business critical events.
Yeah. No, the SOX program reminds me a lot of the goalkeeper role in football or soccer, as everyone here calls it, which is that you don't really get any accolades when things go right, but the second something goes wrong, all of the attention is on you. So it's interesting, the dynamic.
In my career, I've spent a lot of time in Sarbanes-Oxley, and I always think of myself as someone that's like been able to walk in both worlds. I've both executed on really sophisticated Sarbanes-Oxley programs, but then also sophisticated internal audit, true risk-based audit functions and programs. And I always prided myself on being able to use SOX as an opportunity to sort of look behind the curtain and identify other improvements and optimization opportunities. But one of the things that is true about it is no matter how you frame it, it takes a lot of time and a lot of resources to get to do it and to do it correctly. So the more efficiently we can get that done, I think the more it opens us up to do other things.
Yeah, we're certainly working on that with Midship. So it'd be great to see where things go. Thank you so much for your time, Mike. If people want to hear more from you, where can they find you?
Yeah, it's been a pleasure being here with you today. If you want to find me, our website's www.cherryhilladvisory.com. Welcome to email me. Our email address is there, or just find me on LinkedIn. We'll put the link right under my face here.
Absolutely. Sounds great.